Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Usher, and this is the World of Higher Education podcast. Every Christmas, this blog invites the University of Tennessee's Robert Kelchin on the show to do his top 10 stories of the year in the United States. One story keeps coming up. Who in their right mind would want to be a university president these days? What with the financial pressure, the relentless politics both on campus and dealing with state and federal governments, an absolutely thankless job. Well, today our guest is someone who maybe led the way in presidents having thankless tenures. That's Nicholas Dirks. Nick was a department chair in anthropology and then vice president of the arts and sciences and dean of the faculty at Columbia University in the early 2000s. He was thus caught up in that year's arguments about Israel, Palestine, and, if you'll excuse the editorializing, not entirely good faith arguments about anti-Semitism, which was an early forerunner of the post-October 7 landscape right across North America. Then later, Nick moved to the University of California, Berkeley as chancellor. Arguably, it's the best public university in the world. But he arrived just at the moment when the long period of easy money was ending, and student politics was taking its censorious turn. As a result, instead of leading the institution to new heights, his tenure was marked by a degree of fractiousness that left some observers saying that Berkeley was ungovernable. Dirks recently wrote a book called City of Intellect: The Uses and Abuses of the University. It's an interesting work, roughly half about his own experiences at Michigan, Columbia, and Berkeley, but also roughly half more generally about the history and future of universities. Our talk today is structured around that book. And I think it makes for one of the best episodes of this show we've ever had. Dirks is good company and a very nuanced observer, maybe I should say survivor, of higher education leadership. I don't want to give you any more spoilers, and so, over to you. Nick, the first half of your book is really kind of a personal memoir. It sort of takes the reader through your career. You started as a department chair, I think, at the University of Michigan. What does it take to make a great department chair? And are there things about being a great department chair that might make it harder to become a good dean or provost or even president?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, because of course, all of these different roles are seen as part of a, kind of career chain, and people often do one, then begin thinking about the other and assume somehow that the skills that you develop and that you require for these roles are continuous. I wasn't actually a department chair in Michigan. I ran a number of programs. I directed institutes. I created a new interdepartmental PhD program at Michigan that I did chair, which was the interdepartmental PhD in anthropology and history. And it was bringing together two departments, and I never chaired either. But I did get recruited from Michigan to Columbia to be the chair of the anthropology department. And so that's where I began chairing. And yet even that was a kind of unusual assignment, because I was chairing a department that was basically had been taken under receivership, and it was growing very quickly. And I was effectively coming in and having to transform the department. So normal forms of governance only were basically introduced at the end of that process, not at the beginning. I say that because, most chairs rotate into the role and then rotate out of the role, and their jobs are to manage often a very complex entity, but not one that is going to change a lot, one that has to adapt to different kinds of circumstances. And the role of the chair is, I think, a really important one, but it's also a very difficult one, because you have one foot very much still within the faculty, but you have another foot in the administration, and your job effectively is to translate, mediate, communicate, and move back and forth between what you learn in your administrative engagements about the needs of the university overall, about where the department stands, about how it's seen, about what the university not just needs, but what the department in turn needs in order to sustain itself, and trying to find then registers to make departmental needs seem to be university needs, and vice versa, to make university needs comprehensible and even acceptable to faculty who tend to see the administration as representing somebody else. So it's a skill set that is very much being a diplomat, and that is important. And that element of it continues all the way through the chain, all the way up to being a president or a chancellor.
You then moved from Michigan to Columbia, as you said, and you were a dean and an executive vice president, and you were there at a fairly interesting time, I think.
Indeed.
One of the things that you had to deal with was something called the David Project, which produced a film called Columbia Unbecoming, which accused the university of accommodating anti-Semitism in the Department of Middle East and Asian Languages. I was intrigued how you dealt with this because I think you spent a lot of time talking about how you balance, the need to take charges of anti-Semitism seriously, but without compromising on some basic aspects of academic freedom. And, weaponized charges of anti-Semitism are a lot more common now than they were then. Is there something that other people can learn from what you did in that period?
Well, on the one hand, the times were different then. And I think, I benefited in the first instance from a different political climate overall, certainly in the United States, in which it was, I think, easier to say, look, there are protocols that are about maintaining the academic freedom of the faculty, of the intellectual mission of the university, and these are the kind of issues that have to be kept front and center, whatever you do, however seriously you take charges that come from the outside, especially charges that come in the first instance from students, as they did in the Columbia Unbecoming project. There were serious charges of anti-Semitism, and what we did was to say, yes, we will investigate them. And we created a university-wide committee to do what was a pretty thorough investigation at the time. And they spent hours talking to anybody who they reached out to or who reached out to them who had a potential perspective or interest in the question. And they then wrote a report, and the report was made public. And it found that there were no credible charges that would in any way be actionable by the university against faculty. But there were concerns raised about climate, and there were concerns raised about the responsibility of the faculty as pedagogues, as teachers, and the difference between the kinds of responsibilities that you have in the classroom to allow very open discussion and the responsibilities that come with academic freedom in the public marketplace, where you can say pretty much whatever you want to say, or at least that was the idea at the time. So we thought at the time that was the right way to go. There were people in the department who were very unhappy about the investigation, but I think we had a process that we could defend and that we felt had to be, in some sense, the process that you would use to maintain or balance both of the kinds of trajectories that were at play.
But as you said, it's a different time, right? I
Yeah.
mean, would you think a process like that would satisfy anyone today?
To the larger question about what you can learn from the past for this present moment we're in, it would be very hard to say, just allow faculty to adjudicate these kinds of claims, these kinds of grievances, and expect anybody to be satisfied with that. And I think that's, of course, what, was at stake in the administration's assault on Columbia, which was, basically charging the institution at large with anti-Semitism and specifically saying that, that the kind of stuff being routinely taught in the Middle East department was one-sided and politically biased. So, yeah, it's a very different moment, but it's still a moment in which we need to find better ways to balance public concern and faculty governance. And faculty participation is going to be critical if we're going to find something that is going to work even within to address real problems that may exist.
In 2013, I think you then moved from Columbia to University of California, Berkeley, and became Chancellor, which I guess is equivalent of president, but you're part of a system, so it's a different word. And you came in with some pretty big plans, right? Like a reimagining of a modern research university, the creation of a new global campus a few kilometers away from the main campus. But you came at a very difficult moment, right? I mean, cutbacks, tuition freezes, unfriendly environment, both on campus and in Sacramento. You didn't manage to implement much of that. What did you misjudge, do you think, in your initial approach? And knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently? You had a second chance.
Yeah, great question. I mean, first, I'd had these unusual opportunities earlier in my administrative life, both chairing a department that I was able to really rebuild, regrow from scratch in a way, and then being a dean and EVP at Columbia at a time when the university was expanding and there were all kinds of initiatives, and I was able to take advantage of them, grow the faculty, start a lot of new programs, new departments, and maybe I got a little bit too, used to the idea that change was a normal part of administration in higher education, as you know well, because you've been following this and part of this for years. Change is not always a word that goes along with higher education very comfortably. But I certainly went to California with the idea that, it's a place that has led the nation, certainly, in terms of both excellence, but also in terms of intellectual imagination, and that there were things that were almost calling out to be done, refocusing the kind of way in which Berkeley conducted an undergraduate education, thinking about its global footprint, developing new kinds of interdisciplinary initiatives, both within the campus, but also between it and the kind of tech ecosystem in Northern California. But I got there and there was a huge budget hole. I was told that in a year we'd have a $150 million deficit, structural deficit, recurring each year. And so immediately I began to rethink the kinds of changes that I would like to introduce, to think, well, are there changes we can make that would actually make the university a little bit more resilient financially as well as structurally? So yeah, there were lots of plans that I had to rethink. I do believe, however, that there were some initiatives we did that actually continue to this day to thrive, even if the Berkeley Global Campus idea that I came in with was something that had to be put on the shelf.
I have to say your description of Berkeley make it seem fundamentally ungovernable. Is it?
Yeah, I actually quote Bill Kirby, who was the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, wrote a book called Empires of Ideas, which is about universities in Germany, the US, and China. And he does a chapter on Berkeley, and he says he believes Berkeley is ungovernable. So I quoted him just to make it seem like it wasn't just a kind of complaint coming from my own experience. But it is a university that is in some ways very, very hard to think about change in, because it's so good. Clark Kerr, who was the first chancellor at Berkeley and then president of the University of California system, said in his famous Godwin lectures on the uses of the university that the better the university, the less likely they are to want to change anything. And they always talk about the excellence as being the basis on which you keep doing the same old, same old. But on the other hand, California is a place where change is happening all the time, and Northern California in particular. So it seemed to me that it was really important to try to imagine a different way in which the university would both serve students, but also develop new knowledge and conceive of itself as a not just research university doing great work, but also a place that was kind of leading the intellectual, cultural, social, economic charge that California, Northern California in particular, represents. But, it's got very strong faculty governance, which is great, but it slows things down sometimes. More to the point, it's a system, 10 different campuses. It did mean that making major change was difficult from both top and bottom.
If you'd been president of Columbia, would it have been easier to do what you wanted to do? As a private institution versus a public institution?
Yeah, no, there absolutely, and that's really part of the point. In a place like Columbia, my predecessor, the president there when I was serving as dean, Lee Bollinger, was able to do a lot of things. And basically he did them because you would have a board of trustees you worked with. If you had their support, then you could go forward with initiatives. And then you would work to, bring faculty along, and you could always find faculty interested in new ideas if you had resources. What, of course, is the real point, I think, about the Berkeley experience is if you don't have a lot of additional resources, incremental resources, then you're threatening the stuff that people do on a regular basis. And so without resource, at a time of budgetary distress, it's very hard to find the little pockets of resources you need to encourage or to support new kinds of initiatives.
Nick, the second half of your book is not so much about you and your tenure, although it's informed by your various experiences, but it's about the history and future of universities. One thing that you talk about at a couple points in the book is the issue of institutional neutrality, right? So this is a big thing in the United States right now. And you, I think, view this as a logical impossibility, that universities can't be neutral. Why do you think that?
Yeah. So again, this has now become a really big debating point in American universities. It all goes back to the Calvin Report in the 1960s, which articulated a particular kind of view of institutional neutrality, and that too during the protests over the war in Vietnam. So it was really basically trying to say that the university shouldn't opine on American foreign policy as a way of trying to protect the university, at least, against the charge that it was being spoken for by student and, for that matter, faculty protesters. But my view on this is that, on the one hand, I had to, as an academic who then went into administration, I had to learn to be more neutral. I had to learn to be at least more impartial. I had lots of strong views, like many faculty, when I was not a chair, when I was not in these kinds of roles. And I had to learn really to not only, tamp it down a little bit, but also to basically try to be much more ecumenical in the way in which I thought about different kinds of disciplines, different kinds of initiatives, different kinds of perspectives. And then when I went to Berkeley, one of the things I confronted was that students and faculty both would come to me almost on a daily basis saying, will you put out a statement on this, on that, on something else? And I thought we were making far too many statements. So I actually, in the first instance, really would have preferred a situation in which we said, look, let's make clear that the university has views, but it has views on things that relate very specifically to the university. So on those kinds of issues, I was in favor of institutional neutrality. On the other hand, the point, of course, that you're raising here is that many of the things that universities stand for are hardly politically neutral. We believe in free speech. We believe in freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression. We believe that education is a positive value. We believe all kinds of things about, what and how universities should function in contemporary societies, and indeed how they need to be vital parts of contemporary society that clearly a lot of people in the public sphere, and now a lot of people, particularly from, extreme political positions, don't agree with. So they would say articulating those kinds of things are hardly about being neutral institutionally. So I try to find a certain kind of balance between where one needs to be careful about your political statements and public views on the one hand, while on the other, admitting that the university does have values it has to defend and has to speak about.
One, theme that runs through the book has to do with interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, but, the idea of cross-pollinating ideas from different disciplines. And you did Michigan and all the institutions really. You've had different kinds of initiatives. Why is it so hard to get academics to think outside their own discipline? And are there changes to institutional structures or practices that you think might better promote this kind of cross-pollination?
Yeah, well, partly this is the effect of the professionalization of the professoriate and the way in which faculty basically secured certain kinds of fundamental rights, including the right to be reviewed for and then to receive or not, as the case may be, tenure, came out of efforts to say we have professional groups that will provide, the peer group that will effectively evaluate what's good, what's of value, what should be taught, and what kinds of scholarship is going to count. And to do that, you need to compartmentalize. You need to have something like departments that will function. And you need to have not only individual departments, but you need to have a network of departments that are part of a more national, if not international, disciplinary association. Within any given department, faculty would often talk about the university really as being their department. And they would say, if you ask them, do you like being at Berkeley? And they would say, yeah, I really love my department. But they're not answering your question. They're answering a different question, and they're answering it in a way that exposes in some fundamental sense what the issue that I'm raising is. So what I felt, and I felt this across my career, as you said, is necessary is for faculty to think more broadly about, the university that they're in and about the intellectual communities that are not always easy to map directly onto their own disciplinary formation or identity. That being said, all the incentives for and criteria of recognition, promotion, success are rooted in often not just professional communities, but for professional journals, professional associations, and, that's how you get ahead. But I think it can stultify a certain kind of intellectual entrepreneurialism, which I feel is necessary, particularly now today, when we have so many issues that range from not just the political challenges we're facing, but, the role of technology and AI. That doesn't fit into a traditional disciplinary box. And that's one of many things I think that should invite us to think about, we have our departments, but we also have a broader set of obligations, responsibilities, and identities that we need to explore more and take more seriously.
So, are there particular ways of doing this? You talked about more cross-disciplinary appointments, that would be one approach to breaking down those barriers. You can do things like women's studies or area studies or whatever, but really you're just drawing the lines differently, right? You're drawing them horizontally instead
Right.
of vertically. So how do you how do you break down those barriers, those silos in a real way?
When I wrote the book, I was thinking there are lots of pressures that it seems to me we should take seriously and really work to accommodate in terms of creating new kinds of structures in the university. And if you're going to be fighting incentives, then you have to change the incentives. And if you're going to be fighting structures, you have to change the structures. And so you don't just create a few hyphenated programs in areas having to do with different kinds of identity politics. You create across the board more cross-disciplinary kinds of programs and initiatives. University of Chicago actually was very good at that, creating things like a committee on social thought, giving it prestige, giving it resources. And you do that, and all of a sudden, people begin to come to the table and think differently about both their teaching and even ultimately their scholarship and their public engagement, which is what I had in mind.
You talk a lot in the book about the need for universities to experiment with new institutional forms, new forms of internal organization, because as you say, the world's changing, right? And, it's one thing to be like, Clark Kerr and talk about, universities being around since the Middle Ages, but they have changed over the last
They
500
have.
years in many ways. But maybe they're not changing fast enough, right? And you make suggestions about, breaking institutions into smaller constituent parts, making universities more permeable, making them more experimental with respect to graduate education or faculty hires. But look, we've been talking about this for decades, right? We haven't seen many really successful examples of innovation. And I'm curious, like, is this a problem of external regulation? Is it the accreditors? Is it the, state governments who want to know what they're funding? They're not interested in these crazy new ideas. Or is it internal resistance, conservatism, particularly on the part of faculty, to trying new things? What do you think? What's the balance there?
Yeah. You're quite right that a lot of these ideas have been circulating for a long time. I certainly didn't invent them. When I wrote the first draft of the book, I showed it to some people and they said, well, what are you going to do about it? What should we do about it? And so I said, okay, let me come up with some ideas here that effectively are ideas that I'd tried in one way or another, only some of which worked, of course. And I puzzled a lot about what the sources of resistance are to some of the changes. Unfortunately, a combination of demographic transition, budgetary crises, loss of public trust in universities, and now kind of concerted political assault on universities is going to make things happen whether we like them or not. And so I think in an odd way, the current crisis, I don't want to say it's an opportunity, but it is a moment when we really do have to take on board again some of these ideas and think through, what is doable, what should we do, and how could we go about, making some changes that might be more adaptive to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. I mean, just today there was news in the paper about the closure of a college that was
Hampshire College, yeah.
Hampshire College that was established in the 1960s at a different moment, without disciplines, without, with many of the kinds of things that I'm recommending the universities turn to. So, clearly that isn't always working very well. And certainly the 60s idea of that is something that doesn't seem to appeal to a contemporary generation of students. But all of that is to say that I think some of these changes are going to happen. And to be more networked is to take advantage of resources that exist in other colleges and universities, to use technology, to use proximity, but to think differently about, how universities, colleges might be able to work together to deliver wonderful, comprehensive educational experiences to students, but to do so within a much more constrained resource environment. If you could add to that a kind of strategic, acceptance of a set of challenges that will allow you to change things and make things more open to change, I think that would be all to the good. But I don't want to kid anyone about the fact that some of these changes are going to be both painful and some of them made for reasons that we really don't want to give a whole great deal of legitimacy to, because unfortunately, a lot of the attacks on the university are going to just cause damage, plain and simple, and it's going to be hard to recuperate that.
Well, I mean, the Trump years are obviously a low point for American higher education. I read the South China Morning Post every couple of days, and it's remarkable. Every week, there's another, major scholar in the sciences, or biological or physical sciences, heading from the United States to China. You think it's possible for the American system to bounce back from this, or at least that part that resides in blue states?
Yeah. I mean, I think I too follow, what goes on in China, and yet, one reads about, for example, efforts on the part of the European Union to put together resources to attract a lot of American scholars. And you realize that the resources they put together are not going to be adequate to
Yeah.
really make a huge impact on either the population of displaced researchers and scholars in the U.S., or for that matter, the continuous standing of many American universities as still being, the kind of top places for certain kinds of research. But I think what's going to happen is that we're going to see this continuous process where some mid-tier colleges and universities are going to have trouble, and some of them will end up disappearing, like Hampshire College. The top level of both public and private universities will continue, and some of them will have to take haircuts, as they say, but they will continue because they really do have, fundamental strength, and people want to go there and they want to get those names on their degrees and so on. But it's gonna happen at a time when every university is going to have to make hard decisions about where they cut, about how they reconstitute certain kinds of enterprises, and some of the damage is going to continue. I was just at a symposium last night with a cancer researcher from Columbia, and the effects of many of the cuts in NIH and 4 universities like Columbia, they continue to the present day. And there are people who are not going to get their jobs back. There are postdocs who are not going to go back into the academy. There is potentially a whole generation of researchers who are going to kind of move away, and some will move away from the States, and some will move away from the university and do completely other things. And I think it'll take a long time to recover.
Nick Dirks, thanks so much for being with us on the show today.
Thank you.
And it just remains for me to thank our excellent producers, Tiffany McClellan and Sam Pufik, and you, our readers and listeners, for joining us. If you have any questions or concerns about today's episode, or if you have suggestions for future ones, don't hesitate to get in touch with us at podcast@higheredstrategy.com. Join us next week when our guest will be James Waghorn. He's co-editor of a recent book called Doombak Gulguan, The History of Indigenous Australia in the University of Melbourne. A fascinating story. I hope you'll join us. Bye for now.